Escalade Canada. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention at the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. If you're unfamiliar with Zoom, please take a look at the bar at the bottom of your screen. On that bar, you should see a chat option and a Q&A option. We've disabled the chat, so if you have a question, please enter it in the Q&A. You can post your questions on the Q&A board anonymously if you'd like by ticking the box in the entry screen. You can also upvote a question you like or comment on an existing question to add a follow-up. The only thing we ask is that you don't use the Q&A board to message with your friends. Now I'd like to introduce Christiane, the Executive Director of the CEC, who would like to say a few words. Christiane?
Yes, thank you, Liz. Hi, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Christiane Marceau. I'm the Executive Director of Climbing Escalade Canada. I come to you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'm honored to introduce today's webinar, the Estrous Cycle, Estrogen, Periods, and how they can influence performance and training. This webinar is organized by the Ontario Climbing Federation and funded by the CEC Gender Equity Grant. It is our hope to see more girls and womanics take the lead in climbing. During our 2019-2020 competition season, 47% of all participants competed in the women division, while only 24% of coaches identified as female. The OCF is a great example of the positive impact that diversity brings to your community. With a board comprised of 80% women and with a woman provincial head coach, they were able to put together this amazing series of webinars on coaching the female athlete. CEC is proud to support this project through the CEC Gender Equity Grant. I'm also very excited to announce today that the grant will repeat in 2021, which means more opportunities to support projects aimed at increasing female participation in leadership roles. You can support these initiatives and other initiatives by CEC by purchasing your 2021 supporter license on the CEC website and by visiting our online store to buy cool CEC branded gears. Enjoy today's webinar and don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Christiane. And now to our webinar. Joining us today is Dr. Natalie Brown, a climber and research scientist from Wales who studies the Estrous Cycle and its effect on climbing, training, and competition. Thank you so much for coming, Natalie. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Liz, for that introduction. Great to be here. I'm just going to quickly share my screen if I can. Just make sure that's all working. Okay, hopefully that should be up so you can see some of the slides I've put together to go alongside the talk with you guys today. Really great to be here, as I said, and really excited to be able to share some of the work, but also some of my own experiences around periods and performance within sport. And as much as today as I can, I'm going to specifically focus on how that might impact female athletes and females general in climbing and participation. So just to kick off for today, really, I just wanted to give an overview of the menstrual cycle. So I just call this a menstrual cycle 101. So actually, what is happening during the menstrual cycle? We've got two predominant hormones that are interacting that regulate and manage the cycle. So at the start of your cycle, you have your period, the time when you're bleeding. And then we go into, and that's actually a period where we've got quite low hormone levels. This then increases before ovulation, when you get this peak, which is in orange on that graph, in estrogen. Then following ovulation, that's when we kind of go into a high hormone phase of progesterone and estrogen. And they both increase over that luteal phase before decreasing premenstrual. On average, that can be around 28 days, but not everyone will have a 28-day cycle. Kind of the normal range is anything from 21 to 35 days. So you'll always kind of see within the textbooks you have a 28-day cycle, but actually hardly anyone has that perfect kind of duration throughout their cycle, and it really varies. But like I said, the kind of normal average is anywhere between 21 and 35 days. And these hormones, which are produced by the reproductive system, actually interact with the brain. And within the hypothalamus, you've got two different hormones that cause either estrogen to increase or decrease. And that's actually what can cause so many different symptoms related to the menstrual cycle. So that's hopefully, I've just briefly done a light touch over there of the biology, because I don't want to talk too much around kind of the science of it, but actually more how it might impact female athletes, and kind of go on to more about some information around how we might manage that. So I've put up here all different symptoms that were reported by climbers when I interviewed them. So I interviewed 8 elite female climbers, and to understand what their perceptions and what their experiences of the menstrual cycle are. And these were all of the symptoms that were reported that was experienced. Some of them said that they maybe just had one of these symptoms. Other individuals literally probably ticked every single one of these. So it is really, really individual and can affect everyone differently. One of the key things I do always say around symptoms, though, is they shouldn't be debilitating. They shouldn't stop anyone from doing their daily activities. And included within that is obviously training, competing, being able to recover. So you've got anything there. You've got all different physical symptoms such as cramping, backache, bloating, GI disturbance. But then you've also got a lot of more kind of like psychological and behavioural symptoms which can be experienced as well. So you've kind of got worry and anxiety, maybe increases in emotion, feeling more irritable or agitated. So there's all different symptoms that may be presented as a result of the menstrual cycle that might impact training and or competition. But one of the key things which is quite difficult is actually trying to identify the difference between what I call life symptoms and menstrual cycle symptoms. So actually, what days is the menstrual cycle causing you to be more irritable or to be more worried, compared to just day to day, maybe you haven't had such good sleep or you're really stressed? And actually, when are they menstrual symptoms and when are they life symptoms? And actually, quite a lot of the time, some of these life symptoms can really worsen your menstrual symptoms. One thing I want to pick up on with those kind of more psychological behavioural symptoms is mood or emotion. And these are talked about quite interlinking with each other, but actually can be two very separate things, but can also interact at the same time. So the nature of our emotions can inform our moods. So that's when they do interact. However, there are differences in the fact that your mood is not context specific, whereas your emotions are. So for example, you might know what's making you feel sad or angry or happy. So that might be a really good training session, or doing a move that you've not achieved yet, and that's made you feel really happy. But at the same time, you might have a bad session when you've really struggled and that's made you really frustrated or really angry. But actually, sometimes you can just have a mood when you don't really know the cause of that. So you might just feel a bit flat, you might feel happy, you might feel sad, but you don't really know why. And sometimes those moods are a lot longer lasting, whereas emotions may only last minutes. So sometimes a training session might change your emotion, but actually there's an underlying mood that can really affect how you are at training and competition. And that can definitely be influenced by the menstrual cycle. So both your mood and your emotion can be affected by your menstrual cycle. Just going back there to some of the the experiences of female climbers that I spoke to, there was such a range of how it made them feel. And it would be really interesting to speak to you guys during the Q&A after I've presented to see if any of this resonates with you, either yourself or when you've been coaching other female athletes, as to how they felt during training and competition. So just to point, pick out a few there. One, my periods were definitely worse when I was a teenager. So actually age might have an impact on symptoms. And that's really common, that actually the first 2 to 3 years of your period can be much, much worse. It can be really irregular. You can have much heavier bleeding. Kind of your symptoms can be a bit all over the place. There might not be any pattern to that. So it can be really hard to actually track in linking back to that. Is it a life symptom or is it a menstrual cycle symptom? Within the first couple of years, it can be really hard to determine that. And so it's just kind of having an awareness, this will kind of come through in some of the tips and ideas for management I give a bit later on. But just really to try and be aware and understand that it might be your menstrual cycle that's causing you to feel like that. Another one that I always refer back to, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that can relate to this, is I'd rather eat chocolate, watch TV on the sofa instead of going training. And again, that's quite linked to, I'm feeling rotten or really low motivation, of cutting the session. There's definitely a link there of being worried around leaking and blood showing through. And that's actually really distracting. And that came up a lot more and more in a competition setting. So actually within training, it's, there's less pressure that you can maybe pop off to the toilet and manage that. Whereas when you come on at competition, sometimes that can cause a lot more of a distraction and anxiety that you might be leaking, you might be showing through. So that's something really to consider and will lead into some of the management strategies I discuss. Other ones, you want to feel confident, you want to be really energetic, and when you're on your period, you just feel a bit rubbish. So how can you manage that when you're at competition? How can you manage that when you're trying to train at your best every day? It's had a lot of effect on motivation and energy levels, just being happy enough to go and climb because I'm so worn. So just being really tired, and actually, how does that make you feel? More from a physical perspective rather than that emotional feelings of actually how it affects core performance. So that feeling of being bloated, actually affecting core performance. And one thing that came up quite frequently was actually that core tension to hold yourself in and to complete moves, and actually just feeling like you've not got that tension through your body to complete the moves and the exercises that you're aiming to do. So as I said, it'd be really great to hear later on if any of that is familiar or resonates. I know I certainly related to some of that those girls I spoke to definitely discussed. But moving on to really is to how, what is the question is, how do those symptoms affect training and performance? What does that mean in practice? So to start off with, within the period, you've got blood loss, stomach cramps, and GI disturbance. So actually within the time of your period, a lot of that can be anxiety and distraction at competition, but also stomach cramps, trying to do a really good training session when you're in pain. You just want to curl up in a ball and lie on the sofa with a hot water bottle is frequently reported. So actually that can impact performance quite a lot, but there definitely are ways that we can potentially manage that. In this next phase, so this late follicular phase, which is when we've got this peak in estrogen, which is the orange line. So that's actually what we call the feel-good hormone. So estrogen can make you feel really good. It can make you feel more motivated, more confident, have increased energy levels. And I always say this is really a time that you can really try and push hard and get some really hard training sessions done. You've also got this preferential use of glucose, which again favors high intensity exercise. The only thing to be aware of is sometimes an increased risk of injury, just because of the effect estrogen can have on your tendons and ligaments and make them a little bit more lax. But generally, it can make you feel really confident. Decreased risk of illness. So again, it's a really good time to try and push on, get some really good training done. But it's also a really good time for constructive feedback. So because the female athletes are feeling confident, they're feeling motivated, they're normally in a state where actually it's a good time, they want to know how to improve, they can take that constructive feedback. So that can be quite a positive additional thing to consider within that time. Then move into this mid-luteal phase. So as I said, both your estrogen and progesterone levels start to increase, and it's what we call the high hormone phase. And actually you have a real shift there from using glucose, as I mentioned in that previous phase, to using fat as a fuel. So actually within this time, you might have much better endurance capabilities. But on the flip side, there are also other maybe more negative symptoms of feeling bloated, experiencing constipation. So I can't even talk now. The other one I was put there is poor coordination and less risk taking. That's something that I've found more common within climbing than a lot of other sports, of actually the perceptions of risk and fear or being more scared are things that actually can come out during that phase. And then increased body temperature. It sounds really simple, but sometimes actually that increased body temperature can make training sessions feel so much harder because you feel hotter, and it can make a perception of effort much higher. So actually sometimes sessions that you could normally do absolutely fine before can feel much, much harder and impact on what is able to be achieved. And then finally, you have this late luteal phase, the pre-menstrual phase. These, the decline in hormones can cause a whole range of symptoms, and what we normally link to being more negative symptoms. That could be stomach cramps, might start just before you come on your period in this phase. It's actually the increase in stress and inflammation that can really cause those symptoms to be much worse. And that links into there is recovery in this time can be so important. So actually some female athletes definitely report not being able to recover as well. And I always try to recommend really focusing on recovery during this phase. Headaches, fatigue, they're all really common. Increased risk of illness as well. So kind of like more upper respiratory tract infections, more like feeling like I've got a cold come in. That's all completely normal. So again, recovery, really looking after yourself during this time can be key, so that those potentially more negative symptoms don't impact on training. Then I've also put there breast swelling and pain. So that can be another thing that's commonly experienced by female athletes. It's actually not something that I had too many of the female climbers report. It's definitely something that has been more associated with sports such as running, where there's a lot more impact and movement within the breast that can cause that pain to be worse. But as I said before, it's really hard to prescribe and think about all of that, because every individual is different and will experience completely different symptoms relating to the menstrual cycle. So what I experience might be really different to what you experience. But some of those things I put up there are the most common things that are reported, and also the things that we can maybe identify through self-monitoring and tracking. So in climbing specifically, I've tried to use some examples from myself of things, how it really does affect climbing, but these are the things that actually were reported from those female climbers as well. So just some additional ones specific to climbing. Problem solving, that came up quite a lot, as actually sometimes it's much harder to try and work out what the problem is at different times of their menstrual cycle when they're, you know, either indoors or outdoors climbing. As you can see there, I'm kind of sat there just like, I do not get this. And that's definitely something that a lot of female athletes report. Focus can change. So sometimes you can be so focused and able to not think about anything else that's going on. And other times, actually one female really summarized it well, of just said, I get this brain fog and I just can't really think properly. And that can really affect my climbing because I can't clear everything else that's going on in my head just before my period. I've already mentioned the core intention aspect of just actually being able to really hold your core in and for those movements that you need, especially maybe on slightly steeper climbing. Risk and threat, some days just more scared. And again, quite a lot of these appear from a negative perspective just before, so maybe that week before your period's due. Sometimes, especially like maybe the core tension side of things, the first 1 to 2 days. But generally, a lot of these symptoms came the week before. So feeling more scared, just feeling a little bit like you don't want to take some risks, more scared of falling because of hurting yourself. They're all different things that might occur. Confidence, that can, again, the flip side was when that estrogen's level's high, you can feel really confident, really motivated and really strong. But actually in other times, again, just before your period, that confidence could be a lot lower. You can feel a lot weaker and way less motivated to do anything. So it's really think about actually how can we be aware of this and manage that so we can still perform at any day of our cycle. So for example, this day we've got strength and motivation. That was day 1 of my period. I really didn't feel like doing much, but actually once I got going, I felt really good. And I know that if I use a hot water bottle or a hot patch, that can really reduce my stomach cramps, which is normally what makes me have less motivation to exercise on that day. And actually that can then overcome, and all of a sudden something that I'm not motivated for can be one of my best sessions. And the last one I've put there specifically in climbing is got kind of a picture there of pain tolerance. But again, whether that might not just necessarily be skin, it's definitely something, again, a lot of the girls I spoke to mentioned was actually just not being able to tolerate pain so much as they can normally. So just everything hurting a little bit more. Then the other aspect that it can impact on from a health and performance perspective, I've very much talked around having a menstrual cycle, how those symptoms might have an impact. But another aspect of the menstrual cycle is actually we're really lucky to have an extra vital sign as females. So it can be a really good sign to make sure you've got a really good balance between energy intake and energy expenditure. And that balance is crucial. And if you're not taking in enough fuel for your energy that you're going to use within training as an athlete, within climbing, then actually that imbalance can cause you to lose your periods, and what's called relative energy deficiency within sport. And that can have a real impact both on health and performance. You can see there, I've just put this up because it really shows how much it can affect an athlete in all of their areas of physiology. So metabolic, so not just menstrual function, but your bone health is affected. You can get illness a lot more frequently. Psychologically, so maybe more stress, more anxiety. So not only does it impact health, but you've also got this real impact on performance from all different areas. Again, decreased concentration, decreased muscle strength, increased risk of injury, actually not responding to training and having those adaptations that you're aiming for, and decreased coordination. So it can have a real impact. And the menstrual cycle is a really good sign to make sure that actually we are balancing our energy to what our intake and outgoing is. And just really to highlight that again, you can see here that you don't always necessarily know straight away from your performance if you've not got that energy balance right, but normally your menstrual cycle will be the first sign that when that becomes irregular or stops completely, that actually that energy balance isn't there. You can see here an energy balanced athlete can perform and get a much higher performance than an athlete which is deficient in energy. So just that's one thing I always want to stress, that when we talk about the menstrual cycle, and I'll go on now to talk about management, but one of the key things for me when it does come to the menstrual cycle that I do always like to touch on is actually how fortunate we are to have just this extra sign that we're looking after ourselves, that our body is nice and healthy and is getting the fuel it needs to be able to complete the exercise that we're trying to ask it to. And this is one thing that's been really interesting, talking about that loss of period, is actually the impact of COVID on the menstrual cycle. I know it sounds crazy, but actually the impact of so much unknown, increased stress, change in routine is really impacted the menstrual cycle. For some females, that might mean that actually their menstrual cycles come back because maybe they're doing slightly less exercise if it had previously stopped or become irregular. But for others, their menstrual cycle may have now stopped, or actually their symptoms might be much worse. That's been the most common impact of COVID on the menstrual cycle. Its symptoms are much worse, so feeling more stressed, feeling more anxious, increased cramps, maybe heavier bleeding, and all within that kind of pre-menstrual phase. So just before starting your period, those symptoms are much more heightened. And that's how we know it's linked to the menstrual cycle, because when it's been mapped and monitored, rather than it being at any time throughout the month, which is what we'd then associate more with those live symptoms, it's specifically been the week before, repeatedly over a few months. So you can start seeing that that pattern has occurred and is therefore impacting menstrual cycle symptoms rather than just kind of life stresses and symptoms as a whole. So moving on to some management tips for females. So this, first of all, is for female athletes. So whether there's any female athletes or coaches, I thought this would be really important so you can see actually what you can do to help manage some of those menstrual cycle symptoms. First of all, talk. It sounds so basic, but actually having a conversation of what symptoms are affecting you, how is that affecting you in training and performance? And in order to do that, it can be really helpful to monitor your menstrual cycle so you can increase your self-awareness of what symptoms you experience. And that can then help distinguish those that are menstrual cycle symptoms to those that maybe aren't related. So actually every month, do you feel more agitated? Do you have cramps every month? Do you feel more bloated? And how does that relate to training? And through that monitoring and that self-awareness, it can really help then bring up the conversation to actually talk around how that impacts your training and your performance. Be proactive. So reducing your stress levels, whether that's through things like yoga, mindfulness, looking after yourself, even things like having a hot bath, just, being kind to yourself. Nutrition, as I mentioned, fuel and a healthy balanced diet. And sleep is always really important. And those things can help really alleviate some symptoms and reduce the severity of them. Cramps, they are so common. So many female athletes report experiencing cramps, and females across the board, whether we're athletes or involved in participation or we do no exercise whatsoever, they are generally the most common symptom of the menstrual cycle. Light exercise can actually really help reduce those cramps. So something like yoga, some stretching, some light exercise, some nice gentle climbing can actually help. And a hot water bottle. I think for me, that definitely helps. And I know many other females also report that helps. And then the other one is around being prepared. Access to menstrual products, both in training and competition. So one of the key things I mentioned at the start was around anxiety of leaking and of blood showing through clothes. Being prepared and being proactive. So always making sure you've got, as a female athlete, spare products, but you'll see in a minute, that's also something we can be really proactive with as coaches or those involved within climbing, to try and help that unknown or that kind of last minute panic when you're at a competition and you think, I've just come on and I haven't got anything. And rather than that being something to distract performance, actually they know coach, someone within the support team has got spare menstrual products that I can go and ask and go and access, sort it out and still be able to put in a really good performance on that day. It sounds really simple, but has actually made quite a big difference in a lot of cases. So how does this relate to coaches? Talking without euphemisms. So actually try and say the words menstrual cycle, periods, rather than trying to hide that. Because as soon as we try and call it something else, straight away that does display signs that we're maybe uncomfortable, maybe a little bit awkward around talking about the menstrual cycle. So try and talk really openly and using kind of terms that don't maybe try and cover it up. There are so many euphemisms for periods in the menstrual cycle, but just try and talk openly about it. And actually, the more you do it, generally, the more you find it just becomes comfortable and normal. Again, the flip side of those things suggested for female athletes is really try and help promote monitoring and help your athletes to understand their own symptoms so they can try and manage it themselves. I'm always really aware that when you've got female athletes and everyone is individual in the symptoms they experience, you're thinking, how on earth do I manage this if I've got a group of females that I'm trying to coach at the same time? Well, actually, by trying to them increasing their self-awareness can really help with their own self-management combined with talking. So actually have an initial conversation saying, you know, I really struggle with cramps and core tension. You're aware of that. Actually, how can we help manage that? And then they can hopefully have a self-management of that themselves rather than it being something that really influences and everyone needs different types of training or different support at different times. Creating support systems can be another really positive things to help manage that. So I've put just an example of younger and older pairs there. So that's worked really nicely that sometimes you've got older climbers and younger climbers, and you can actually maybe, you know, within different sessions or different groups of trying to pair them together. So actually if that younger climber has got any questions or uncertainty or worry, they know that they've kind of got someone they can go there and talk to if they don't necessarily want to come and talk to a coach or anyone else. And as I said, provide access to menstrual products in training and competition. That can just really reduce so many different anxieties at competition in particular, and also reduce the amount of training sessions that may be interrupted because all of a sudden they've come on and they can't continue their session because they're worried about bleeding. Actually, it's a really easy way to try and help manage those symptoms. So kind of those ones there were the flip side of what that meant to coaches, of what I kind of recommended that athletes can do. But just some additional points for coaches to be aware of. Try and really know your athlete and respond as you would with any other topics. So if you talked about anything else in training, whether that's around movement or adaptation or feeling stronger or thinking about endurance, the menstrual cycle is a biological function, and try and consider it as what it is rather than maybe what has been created within society now, that it's something that is maybe secretive or something to be embarrassed by. Think about what approach lands best with the individual athlete. So again, trying to help that self-management, self-awareness. Provide opportunities to receive advice, ensure they know they haven't just got to suck it up. I've put that there as a quote because that was what was frequently reported. I just have to deal with it and just suck it up was really, really common. And actually that's not the case. There are things that we can actively do to reduce symptoms and to manage them. It's not just something to persevere with in the background. And then, you know, really help your athletes identify any management strategies in training through planning. So actually, do they really struggle with a specific symptom? And would that potentially impact if you've got a major competition coming up? What can you do to plan to try and help reduce that and therefore make that female athlete feel confident that they can perform? So here's some questions or steps as such to get started. So first of all, have you previously discussed the menstrual cycle with your female athletes? Secondly, is the female athlete taking contraceptives or experiencing natural cycle? So everything I've discussed regarding the estrogen and the progesterone is linked to a natural cycle. Whereas when you take contraceptives, you can still experience symptoms that I've discussed, but not as a result of those fluctuating hormones. You actually have quite flatline hormones when you take contraceptives. And it can be at different times, such as when you have a week of like a placebo or no pill, for example, that actually those symptoms might be apparent. But that can vary as to how they're going to respond and how they manage those symptoms. So that might be something really important. And likewise, in some instances, it's actually the contraceptive that's causing symptoms, and it's just that one form of contraception. So someone might really struggle taking a combined pill, which is synthetic estrogen and progesterone, and cause really severe symptoms, whereas they might be absolutely fine if they went onto a progestin only mini pill. So again, it's not necessarily something they need to deal with, but is worth having a conversation if they're contraception or natural cycle, as to how that then informs your next questions and conversation. Have you observed, or has your female athlete suggested any symptoms which might impact training? And as I've said at the start, what is the usual pattern of performance? So using monitoring and athlete self-awareness to determine when that's menstrual cycle symptoms and when that's maybe just additional life symptoms, so school stress or any other things that might be causing different impacts on training performance that aren't linked to the menstrual cycle. And then finally, what are those symptoms and how would that influence climbing? Are they direct influence, so is that cramps, or is that actually more indirect, so their mood, their motivation, their relationships, of how they communicate and interact? Because both things can affect obviously training and competition, but in potentially quite different ways. This is probably one of the key things that I always like to highlight, is around talking. It's not a secret and it's not embarrassing. It is just a biological function. The same as within sport, we talk about heart rate increasing. That's due to a hormone response. Breathing rate increasing, feeling motivated, feeling scared, they are all hormonal responses. Exactly the same as the menstrual cycle, it is a hormone response. So actually it shouldn't be anything that we're embarrassed or hide or don't talk about. It should just be something that can be really openly talked about and also discussed. And when we are coaching female athletes, we're trying to find the way of making them perform and adapt at their very best. We want the best out of their bodies to be able to climb as well as they possibly can. And actually not considering the menstrual cycle is leaving kind of a stone unturned, really. It's, that's one thing that could really impact, so should equally be talked about. So how to actually start that conversation? I've kind of put 4 key points there that I've found have really helped to provide guidance for coaches to start a conversation with their female athletes about the menstrual cycle. So first of all, think about the clarity of the message. So actually consider sharing an observation. Is that I've noticed for the last 3 months, you've really struggled with cramps, or you've been quite low motivated at this time. Is there a reason for that? Is that related to the menstrual cycle? So be really clear what it is that you want to talk about, and trying to give an example can be really useful, and that's where that evidence links in. So actually try and share some of the facts and knowledge, and within that maybe share some of this information I've shared with you today, that actually it could be your menstrual cycle that's making you feel like this, because of how it interacts, and obviously some of what I've shared today about hormones causing different symptoms. Next, really listen. So actually understand that athlete's experience. How is the menstrual cycle for them? And I know this sounds really silly, but that's for female coaches as well, because actually as females, we've got our own experiences of the menstrual cycle, but actually that could be really different for another female. So actually really try to understand and listen to what their own experience is. And therefore, as a result of that, what support or what action could be put into place as a result of that. I've put kind of key 3 points that I always that kind of summarize it quite nicely when we're talking around the menstrual cycle. No silence, so talk openly, make it normal part of conversation, and trying to do that within a training environment. It's about the environment, so actually changing those perceptions so it does just become a normal part of training. It's not something that's secret, it is just part of training, part of any other questions that you'd normally ask. No secrecy, so say what you really mean rather than trying to hide. Or it always shocks me that so many females would prefer to say I'm ill or I've got a bad stomach rather than just saying I've got period cramps. So a lot of the time they'd actually prefer to say they've got a bad stomach or they're ill than they are actually having just period cramps. So again, try and encourage them to actually say what they mean and what they're feeling, but have no judgment at all. So educate yourself. So obviously you've all attended today, so hopefully this is the first step of maybe increasing awareness or a little bit more understanding of the menstrual cycle, but also try and have empathy. So really think about how that might affect training and performance. And just because one female athlete is experiencing no symptoms and managing absolutely fine, that doesn't mean to say that all of the other females that you're working with are the same. As I said, some might have really severe symptoms, really struggle, really impact training and performance. Others, it might never ever be a concern and they might never experience any symptoms. So it's just being really aware of not judging and not thinking just because one person's coping, the other ones aren't. So from today, I really want you just to think about one action that you're going to complete following this talk. So even if that's going away to learn a little bit more about the hormone responses, or having a conversation with one other person, even if it's not a female athlete, but just one other person, to try and feel comfortable saying the words menstrual cycle and starting a conversation. So I just want you to have a couple of minutes I'm just going to give you now to write down, have a think about that, and then provide opportunity if you've got any questions you'd like to ask.
Thank you, Natalie. That was awesome. There are a few questions in the chat here. So remember, if you have a question, sorry, not the chat, the Q&A. If you have a question, go to the bottom of your screen, click on the little Q&A thing there, and you can enter your question. And if you're interested but you don't have a question, you should go in there anyway, and you can upvote the questions that you like as well. So let's start with the most upvoted one. So that's increased hunger is a symptom that is often reported. Does this mean that you're actually burning more calories, or is it your hormones saying you're hungry when you're still properly fueling your body?
That's a really good question, and it's actually a little bit of both. So definitely within the second half of your cycle, you can actually, yeah, as you said, burn more calories there, so you can feel more hungry. But it's also being aware of what food you're craving. So there's two things that can be happening there. Is yes, you can feel more hungry, but you can also experience an increase in food cravings, and sometimes they're not necessarily the best choices that we could make within food cravings. So it is typically chocolate, maybe more fatty foods, and actually things that are more kind of processed and higher in sugar can actually worsen your symptoms more so than actually if you try to keep more of a balanced diet as much as possible.
Oh, what a bummer.
Easier said than done. Dark chocolate's always good. I am always like, there's your savior, just have a little bit of dark chocolate.
Okay, cool. Another one, when should we start talking to female athletes about menstrual cycles, and should we include our male athletes in these conversations?
Definitely. So menstrual cycles, the kind of age range that menstrual cycles start is anything from 8 to 15. So you've actually got a huge range when you might actually have your female athletes starting their periods. which does make it difficult. At what point do you then start picking them up and talking? But actually for me, I think it'd be more important to start talking to them slightly younger, so you haven't got females that are 9-10 years old starting their periods and not knowing what's going on or not knowing how to manage that. One of the girls I spoke to literally said to me, when I started my period, I went to my mum and said, "Mum, I'm dying because I'm bleeding." She just didn't know what was happening. So again, that awareness and how you manage that could be really important. So actually talking to them when they're younger can be really important, because those girls, as they get older, are obviously around more, there's more conversations going on, so they'll pick up on that information, so they're more prepared if they do start when they're more kind of like 14, 15, than if you've got someone that's really young. And then I think the second part of that was around including male athletes in the conversation. And I think that's actually really important. So just an example I've done actually in another sport, so within swimming, what we've done is actually got a group together of all of the male and female athletes, had a conversation about the menstrual cycle, but then had a second either different day or just immediately after, then got just the girls by themselves. They feel a bit more comfortable talking and asking questions. But what we wanted to try and avoid doing that is starting that perception of it's something that is secret. The boys you don't talk to about this. You have to keep it hidden. You have to keep it secret. And that does start then fulfilling that kind of perception and culture and environment that we're trying to change, of having it being something open that is everyone feels able they can discuss.
Great, thank you. All right, another anonymous. I think you answered this, but there's some follow-up. So how are hormone levels in each phase affected by hormonal birth control? And you did answer that, but then the follow-ups are, I've heard that birth control can hide some symptoms of energy deficiency by giving false regular periods. Is this true? And are there other ways to ensure your periods are healthy?
So yeah, that's when you're taking any form of hormonal contraception, if you do experience bleeding, that's not actually a period, it's what we call a withdrawal bleed. So that is actually, as it is exactly as you've termed it there, it's actually like a false period. So it's not, we call that a withdrawal bleed. And again, because it's what happens is when you stop taking that hormonal contraceptive for a period of time, which causes the withdrawal bleed, it's the not having those hormones being put in your body every day that are synthetic, that can cause your body to have normally a much lighter or shorter bleed. And so that then makes it really hard, and a lot of the time is actually you don't necessarily know that you're maybe energy deficient at that time, because actually it's not your natural body that's regulating the hormones, it's synthetic that you're putting into it. So actually sometimes it can mask whether you are energy deficient. So that can be one thing just to be aware of, and it's actually a really hard thing to manage, because obviously hormonal contraceptives, sometimes you're on them actually for the purpose of contraception, not managing symptoms. So yeah, there are some other symptoms, signs and symptoms of energy deficiency, because for example, males don't have a menstrual cycle, so we have to pick it up in different ways from them, and normally that's like a longer period of time when they're not performing, feeling constantly tired. They're kind of two of the key things, and what we'd describe as being very similar to that overtraining, overreaching type symptoms. But it is, as I said, females are actually really lucky having the menstrual cycle, because it can be a really immediate sign and picked up way quicker than if you didn't have those.
Great. So another follow-up to that was, is there a way to monitor your cycle if you have an IUD and no longer receive periods?
You can definitely track to see if you have any symptoms. So there's some kind of more predominant symptoms I've discussed today around like bloating, changes in mood, stress levels, anxiety, risk, feeling scared. And actually you can kind of track those to see if you do have different fluctuations in those, especially taking an IUD, you can still experience sometimes those ups and downs, even if you don't have a period. But at the same time, it might just be something that actually it levels those out and you just kind of don't have any severe symptoms at all. That can be quite individual when it comes to the IUD.
Okay, great. Another question. If the symptoms are debilitating, what do you recommend?
If symptoms are debilitating, as in not being able to complete daily activities, train and competition, that's when I always suggest seeking medical advice, because there might be something underlying that's affecting that, because symptoms should never be that severe that it's really affecting your day-to-day activities. And actually there might need to be some sort of management strategy that's put in place from a medical perspective.
Great, thanks. Here's another one from Leah, I think. When an athlete is having her period in a training or competition, what would be your coaching approach?
It depends in what aspect. Obviously, in some cases, if an athlete's having their period in training and competition, it's not affecting them at all. It would just be being really supportive, making sure that, you know, it's not causing them any anxiety or distracting them at competition. They're not worried about leaking. I would definitely make sure I have a conversation with them in advance to know actually how they feel, what their experiences of their period is like, to then know if there's anything as a coach I need to put in place or help support with, so they can make sure they still get the most out of their training or competition.
Great. So this one isn't really a question, but I guess more of a talking point. Bethany says, can't recommend bringing menstrual products to comps enough. As one of the only female coaches in my area, I started doing this, but now have all the male coaches doing it too, and it's come up multiple times. Athletes always appreciate, and since it being common knowledge, everyone is more comfortable asking/talking about it.
That's super great to hear, and like a really good example of actually how much of a difference that can make. It does seem to be frequent that females actually even start their periods when it's like their first competition or when there's increased stress. That does seem to be really, really common. And obviously you've then got potentially a younger female who's, it's the first time they've been on their period and they want to try and compete at a competition. And actually just something as simple as knowing they can go to someone, say, I've just started my period, and have that help and support can be the difference between all of the training they've done going out the window because they can't compete because they're so worried, and actually still being able to just get on and perform and completely manage the situation.
Great. Oh, another one. Do you have any advice other than symptom management, more how to manage self-perception when competition falls in hard cycle days?
I think that's really linked to that monitoring and that self-awareness. If you then know that you're going to potentially have those days when you're not feeling as great, if you've got that awareness in advance of competition, then it's so much easier to be able to put something in place, whether that's you know, knowing that certain exercises you're really going to struggle with, that's going to reduce your confidence. So maybe not doing those when you're warming up in a competition, or, you know, different strategies of how you can maybe reduce your anxiety or worry. Is that just like a certain music that you like to listen to, or someone that you find helps you talking to? So again, having that self-awareness then really helps being able to put strategies in place in advance of competition, so then you're able to manage that.
Great. There don't seem to be any other questions. So if you have a question, type it in now. I do have one because it seems like a lot of this is coming back to like monitoring and being really self-aware and sharing those symptoms. So do you recommend using an app, or what do you think works best there? And if there is an app that you really like, could you recommend it to us?
Yeah, that's a great question, Liz. Different things work for different people. So in some instances, if you've got a training diary, even just putting like a star or a P when you start your period, or writing down different symptoms that you experience on different days can help within your training diary. For others, an app can be really helpful. So there's so many different apps. I find Clue really, really good, because it allows you to put in your cycle, add any symptoms you want, but without giving you loads of information. If you did want something that maybe gives you more a way of monitoring, but also actually gives you quite active information about the menstrual cycle in different nutrition strategies and different training advice, then Fitter Woman is also a really good app. And I'm happy to kind of write down those details and share with you after the webinar if that's helpful.
Great, yeah. Another question came up. Do you recommend using pain medication or anti-inflammatories for abdominal pain?
Again, it's obviously that there's so many caveats when you're saying to use different medications as to whether you've got any kind of underlying medical reasons why you can't take anti-inflammatories. But definitely, if it's especially around competition, if you know that you want to perform and maybe things like light exercise and heat or anything like that isn't going to completely take that pain away and would be a distraction, then you've definitely got the option of having over-the-counter pain medication in order to be able to try and reduce that. So things like paracetamol and anti-inflammatory ibuprofen.
These are some, they're not really questions, but more little tips from our audience. We have Athlete Monitoring is a complete Canadian-based training app, which includes a female hormone cycle module. So maybe you can all check that out. And then another one for athletes that are self-conscious about leaks. Having a pair of leak-proof period underwear is a good option. Not visible in tights, don't shift in awkward positions, more comfortable than other options. Oops. Yeah, and then somebody kind of upvoting the anti-inflammatory might not help everybody. So great. Any other questions?
Yeah, and so
Go for it.
Definitely with the anti-inflammatory, it can be something that is, again, being proactive and might need to be taken a couple of days before your period starts, because otherwise, obviously, it's almost like that inflammation has already occurred that can result in the cramps happening anyway, rather than being kind of, it's almost like trying to firefight the inflammation that's already there when you're then trying to take the anti-inflammatory. So definitely for some people as well, that as that attendee has said, might not actually work for some people or need to be a bit more proactive with it.
Great. Okay, here's another question. Can you speak to the pre-menstrual recommendations in ROAR, aspirin plus, to prevent symptoms? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm not familiar with what that recommendation is within RAWs, so I just really wouldn't want to comment on that and say anything that either isn't correct or not, just because I'm not aware of that. So I'm going to leave that one, sorry.
If whoever it says it's anonymous, but if you want to put your name there, I can unmute you and you can explain that if you'd like. But otherwise, yeah. Last chance. Are there any suggestions of foods to eat to help reduce PMS symptoms?
I'm currently doing a review of this to try and work out what foods there is evidence to support PMS symptoms, because there are a whole host of different foods that are being recommended from an anti-inflammatory perspective to try and reduce those symptoms. So at the moment, I wouldn't want to list all of like what definitely we do and don't know, because that's something that's still being investigated. But one thing that is I would be happy to recommend is actually just really trying to think about processed foods, and actually processed foods can cause more inflammation and actually worsen symptoms. So actually really just trying to get a good balanced healthy diet is kind of probably one of my biggest recommendations with that fruit and veg intake at the moment.
Great, and there is a follow-up here about how much dark chocolate is too much dark chocolate.
Depends what day you ask me on. Some days I'll be like 1 cube, other days it might be like a whole a whole bar of chocolate's fine. Yeah, again, it's all about that, just moderation and kind of what is a normal balanced diet. And yeah.
Great. All right, last chance, folks. I think we could probably wrap it up. That seems like all the questions have been answered. Thank you so much for coming, Natalie, and talking to us today. That was amazing. I hope I'm sure everybody learned lots from this. I certainly did. So that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks all for having me. I've really enjoyed talking to you guys. Any questions, I'd be more than happy to provide my details to follow up and ask me them after the webinar.
Yeah, great. I guess if anybody would like that detail, your contact info, they can get it through us. Then can absolutely do that.
Everyone, don't forget to sign up for the next 2 webinars hosted by the OCF next weekend, and the one after that. They promise to be very good as well. Thank you, Natalie. That was awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Christiane, for that reminder. Next weekend, same time, noon, we have Madeline Crane talking about female climbing psychology and rivalry between females. And then the following Saturday, which is in March, is Marissa Michael with nutrition. So tune in. All right, folks. Have a great day, and we'll see you next weekend.